Good morning, ladies. Today we're learning about the poem African Thunderstorm by David Rubaderi. Now, normally when I teach this poem, I like to ask people what they think of thunderstorms, whether they like them or not. And generally there are quite a lot of people that do like thunderstorms. They find them exhilarating or maybe relaxing and soothing, especially when you're nice and cozy indoors, maybe under a blanket with some hot chocolate, and you're listening to it outside. Okay, now that's the kind of storm that we are not going to be talking about. The title is African Thunderstorm, so we need to know that the setting is very rural, that we're thinking of this vast open space which is very exposed and very vulnerable to a storm. Okay, and if you've ever gone like hiking in the Berg when there's been a thunderstorm, you'll know that it can be very dangerous. Just a little bit about the poet before we go on and look at the poem. David Rubaderi was born in 1930 and died in 2018 at the age of 88. Alright, so he is quite a contemporary poet, and in fact he was one of Africa's most widely celebrated poets. He was born in Malawi and was not only a poet but a playwright, a novelist, and a diplomat. Now, there are two different ways that this poem can be interpreted. We can read it at its surface level in a very literal way, that we are literally talking about a thunderstorm, or we can read into it on a deeper level, on a metaphorical, figurative level, and then it has political undertones. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through it line by line and look at it on a literal level, and then I'll talk about the metaphorical meaning afterwards. Okay, so you can see that the poem is split into 4 stanzas. The first 2 are looking at the effect that the storm has on nature, and the last 2 looks at the effect it has on the people. Okay, the poem begins with an extreme sense of anticipation and suspense, as we can really see the storm starting to build up. Okay, so it begins with line 1, from the west, clouds come hurrying with the wind. Okay, so from the west tells us the direction that the storm is coming in. Now, I don't know anything about geography, but I asked Mrs. Tyler, and she said that a westerly wind would bring a cold front and rain. Okay, so this is obviously true. The storm is going to be blowing in. In line 2, we see a personification. Okay, the clouds are hurrying. You'll see I've just highlighted all the kind of figurative speech and all the images. So the clouds are hurrying in. It gives a sense of speed and the strength of the storm, that they're coming quickly across the sky. If you look at line 3, and in fact there are quite a few examples of this, we see that it begins with a present participle. Okay, so now remember that is a verb in present continuous tense. So line 3 is an example, turning. Line 7 and 8 are also examples, whirling, tossing. Okay, so they're all verbs, but they all end in that ing. Okay, they're present participle. And it tells us that the action is taking place right now. It's immediate and it's continuous. Okay, the wind didn't just blow once and now it's done. It's happening right now. And it really shows how the movement is constant and how fast it is. Okay, so the wind is blowing sharply, turning, and in line 5 it says here and there. And the fact that the wind keeps changing direction, that it's here and there, really creates this sense of chaos. Okay, and this atmosphere of uncertainty. And that all just really adds to this feeling of suspense. Okay, that something is building up, it's uncertain, it's chaotic, and that can make it quite scary. In line 6, we see another figure of speech. There's a simile, and it compares the clouds to a plague of locusts. Okay, so we know it's a simile because of that word like, and obviously there are lots of clouds. Okay, that's why it's been compared to this plague of locusts. And locusts have these really negative connotations, that they are a nuisance and unwanted, and often they bring with them disease and death. Okay, so again, this is a very ominous image. Again, talking about the wind in line 7 and 8 and 9, it's whirling, it's tossing up things on its tail like a madman chasing nothing. Okay, so we really see how destructive the wind is here. It's treating nature like a toy. As it blows through, it's just picking up things, branches, leaves, whatever it comes across, and it's just tossing them and throwing them and using it as if it was a toy. Okay, the simile in line 9, like a madman chasing nothing, just really illustrates how dangerous the storm is. If you think of a madman, that's someone who's completely unpredictable. You don't know what they're thinking, what they're going to do next. So comparing the wind to that makes it seem very dangerous, because you don't know what direction it's going to turn in. You don't know what is going to happen next, but definitely the sense of this dangerous storm which is blowing in. All right, moving on to line 10. Pregnant clouds ride stately on its back. Okay, so again we have another image of these clouds which are blowing in on the back of the wind, and it's described as pregnant clouds. Okay, so again that's a personification, and if you think of a pregnant woman, generally they're quite large and heavy, and they would be full of a baby. But here we're picturing the clouds, which are heavy and full with moisture. Okay, pregnancy also has that sense of suspense, okay, that something is about to be unleashed at any moment. So we have these pregnant clouds which are poised, ready to unleash their rain at any second. Okay, so they gather to perch on hills like sinister dark wings. So again, you'll see that there's a simile there. And the clouds are being compared to birds, which are perching there, kind of waiting. So we have the sense of them almost being predatory birds that are waiting there, almost like a vulture or something. And that word sinister is also a very ominous word. Okay, so the idea that they're kind of waiting there and that they're going to bring destruction with them. In line 14 and 15, the wind whistles by and trees bend to let it pass. Okay, so line 14 again, we see there's a personification there with the wind whistling, but also notice that alliteration. Okay, the wind whistles. That really mirrors the sound of the storm, the sound of the wind blowing. Okay, and line 15 really shows us the effect that the storm is having on nature. We see that the trees are very subdued. Okay, this idea of them bending to let it pass. Obviously, the storm is very strong. The wind is blowing them so that they're bending over. But it almost creates an image of the trees bending down. So as the wind blows past it, they bow to it. And this emphasizes the power of the storm, that nature is just so submissive to it. Okay, moving on to stanza 3, we're now focusing on the village and on the people who live in that village. All right, so in line 16, the word village actually has connotations of it being quite rural, that it's not too built up, and so it wouldn't be very protected. Okay, so we're really picturing this in this vast open space and how exposed and how vulnerable they would be to a big thunderstorm. Okay, now there's 3 different groups of people that we're going to see in this stanza. The children, the women, and then the babies. Okay, so firstly we look at the children and their reaction to the storm. And we see that there are screams of delighted children being tossed up and turning in the din of the whirling wind. Okay, so very contrasting reactions as we move on and look at how the other groups of people react. We'll see that. But basically, the children are described as being delighted. Okay, for them, because they live in this rural area, we can assume that perhaps there's not that much to do there. And so for them, the storm would be something which is a novelty, something that's exciting. And so they're swept up in the thrill of this. Even the idea that it could potentially be dangerous, to them is exciting. So they're running around and they're screaming, but they're screams of joy, not of fear. Okay, and the screams are being tossed and turned in the din of the whirling wind. Okay, so it's almost like their screams are being drowned out by the sound and the force of the wind. Okay, in line 19, that word din really shows how loud the sound of the storm is and that it's building in intensity. Okay, that whirling wind, the idea that it's gathering and it's picking up. Okay, moving on to line 20. Now we're looking at women. So this is the second group of people. And it starts in line 20 and continues in line 22. Women dart about in and out madly. Okay, so we just see this frantic motion of the women. They're darting about in and out. So they're going in and out of the houses, and presumably they are trying to prepare and trying to get things in place that might protect them from the storm. Okay, so very different to the children, and also very different if we look at the first two stanzas. We're reminded that nature was very submissive. It just bowed down and let the storm pass and let the storm do whatever it wanted, whereas the women are trying to be proactive and they're trying to prepare. Okay, obviously, at the end of the day, everyone is subject to the storm and the force of the storm, and everyone, the people and nature alike, are all at the storm's mercy. Okay, going back up to line 21, we see the third group of people, who are the babies. Now, the babies are being carried on the backs of the women, and the word that's important here is that they are clinging to their backs. Now, clinging is when you obviously hold on tightly. So we get the impression that the babies are feeling fear. Now, that doesn't mean that the babies understand and know better than the children, but perhaps they are being made anxious because of the woman's frantic movements. Maybe they're picking up on the fear of their mothers. Definitely the sounds and the sights of the storm would be something new to them, and so all of this is making them feel anxious. Okay, lines 25 and 26, we see the wind whistles by while trees bend to let it pass. Now hopefully you notice that that is an exact repetition of lines 14 and 15. Okay, literally the exact same lines. Now this is obviously effective because a storm is filled with repetitive noises. So by having those lines repeated, it just shows the ongoing continuous fury of the storm. All right, so we've got these different groups of people running around outside. All of them are doing different things. And while they're outside, their clothes wave like tattered flags. Okay, in line 27. So here we see that the wind is so strong that it's causing their clothes to wave. There's a simile here. It's being compared to a flag. Obviously, a flag blows in the wind, but notice here we don't get the impression of a flag, blowing in a gentle breeze. Okay, here it's described as a tattered flag. Now that could mean that their clothes are maybe quite well worn and torn, but it could also describe the sharp angles that their clothes are making as it blows, and it really shows the strength of the wind that it's blowing so strongly. In fact, in lines 28 and 29, we see that the wind pulls the clothes off of the women. It's flying off to expose dangling breasts. Okay, now I'm sure most of you at some point have gone swimming in a bikini and had an unfortunate accident, okay, where you've come up and you found yourself exposed. Okay, and obviously it is very embarrassing, but it does leave you feeling very exposed and very vulnerable. Okay, so the fact that this has happened to these women, that they are left exposed, just really emphasizes how much they are at the mercy of the storm, how vulnerable they are. Okay, not just them, but the village as a whole. All right, in lines 30, we see that the storm has now reached its peak. So we've seen most of the poem is building up, the storm is gathering intensity, and then in line 30 it reaches its peak. Okay, so line 30 says jagged, blinding flashes. That describes the lightning. In line 31 we see the rumble, tremble, and crack. Okay, so that's describing the thunder. And notice the use of onomatopoeias in those lines. or that line. So rumble, tremble, crack. Okay, definitely we can see that those are onomatopoeias, and again it's mirroring the sounds of the storm. Okay, in line 31 and 32, the crack and the smell of the fired smoke, that tells us that the village has been hit by lightning. Okay, the smell of fired smoke tells us that there's a fire and that there has been done damage to the village. And in line 33, the pelting march of the storm, that describes the rain. Okay, and there's a metaphor in those lines because it's saying that the storm is a pelting march. The rain is a pelting march. Okay, so think about an army which is marching along, and think of that, the sound of their marching. It would be a pitter-patter, but a lot more than that. It would be forceful. There would be lots of footsteps, and it would kind of be echoing and drowning out any other sounds. And so as the rain starts, it reminds us of the army marching because of the rhythm and because it is so forceful. And it creates that idea that it cannot be stopped. The structure of the poem is quite interesting. You'll notice that each stanza is actually made up of one sentence, which is stretched over several lines. So obviously that is an example of enjambment or run-on lines. And what that does is it creates a fast pace throughout the poem, and it really shows us how the storm is building up, how it's blowing in with speed, and it's gathering speed as it goes, and we see the forcefulness of the storm through that fast pace. We also notice that there are many sound devices throughout the poem. I've spoken quite a bit about this already. So we see examples of alliteration, we see examples of onomatopoeias, and we also see repetition through certain lines. And all that this is doing is really showing us the repetitive sounds that we hear with the storm, and it's really showing us the sounds that we would hear in the storm. Alright, so we've spoken quite a bit about the literal meaning of the poem. Now let's move on and talk about the metaphorical meaning. So when we look deep at this poem, we can definitely pick up on political undertones. And the entire poem could be an extended metaphor for colonial invasion. So let's look at some examples of this. Firstly, the poem begins with the wind blowing in from the west. Alright, now that's interesting because if we look at the settlers who came from Europe, that is actually coming from the west. In fact, they were often described as Westerners. The force of the storm could describe how Africa was forcefully invaded. And if we look at the example of the wind, which was blowing through, picking up and tossing aside anything in its path, that could represent how any values that were important in an African culture were just kind of tossed aside. The reaction that we saw of nature to the storm was that it was very subdued, that the trees were kind of bending as the wind passed. And that could represent how Africans were subdued out of fear, and how they perhaps bended their ways to Westerners. And then looking at the storm itself in the last stanza, looking at the force of it, the crack, the smoke, all of that could represent the actual invasion of a village. Okay, and the crack and the smoke could represent gunfire. And we look at the different people's responses and how much they contrasted. So the idea that perhaps the children didn't quite understand what was happening, that they were thrilled and delighted with the novelty of this and of seeing new things such as the guns, that perhaps the mothers understood a little bit better what was happening, and they were frantic trying to prepare and to protect themselves. So this poem as a whole could be looking at colonial invasion and the havoc that it caused on Africa.